a little bit in more detail. So first up, there were some white Southerners that supported the new Republican government. Many of these Republicans had been opposed to secession in the first place in 1860, but they were very few, and so there weren't enough of them, and they weren't powerful enough to really voice their opinions. And so since they had been opposed to secession in the first place, and they were actually in favor of these new Republican governments, many white Southerners believed that anyone who helped the new government was a traitor. So they started calling these Southern Republicans scalawags, and a scalawag was a name used for a small, scruffy horse, or like this, or some other less desirable farm animal. You know, you've got your good cattle, your good horses, but then you've got the ones that no one really wants, and that was the term scalawag comes from that. And I'm not really sure why. I guess that's why this was considered an insult, but I mean, the actual word scalawag, it sounds very demeaning, and you were a traitor, you small scruffy horse. Yeah, you're a traitor, you scalawag. That sounds much more harsh than small scruffy horse or you undesirable farm animal. So the first group were white Southerners who actually supported the Republican governments, and ultimately they were looked at as traitors by the other people living in the South. The next group we'll talk about are Northerners that had moved to the South. So with these new Republican governments in place, the South was wide open for Northerners to come down and work. Some came to try and get rich on the rebuilding of the South, but some were actually former Union soldiers who, while they were fighting in the South, had really fallen in love with the area and realized, like, as they were there as soldiers, that they really wanted to live there and wanted to start their lives there. And so because many of these Northerners came down in a hurry, they were only able to pack a few personal belongings in small, cheap suitcases called carpet bags, because they were many of them were actually made out of pieces of carpet. So because they packed everything that they owned into these carpet bags, the transplanted Northerners became known as carpetbaggers, because they just hurried down to the South, even though, like, some of them really wanted to build lives there, but a lot of them went down just to try and get rich with the help of these new Republican governments. So you got scalawags, you got carpetbaggers. The last group, and by far the largest group that now had a voice in Southern politics, was African Americans. And pictured here is a group of senators that had been elected during Reconstruction. So before the war, even free African Americans had no say in Southern politics. But now, with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, African Americans were citizens, they could vote, and they had all the rights guaranteed to any other American citizen. Some of them ran for public office, and from 1869 to 1880, there were 16 African Americans elected to Congress. But despite these victories, freedmen still had less political influence than whites, but sometimes progress comes along very slowly. So our first video is going to look at these new voices in Southern politics, and once that's done, we'll pick up with the next section.
In 1869, Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black U.S. Senator. Eventually, 22 blacks became members of Congress. On the home front, Reconstruction influenced the state's political events. During the winter of 1867 to 1868, 10 southern states held state constitutional conventions. Since most of the political leaders of the South were part of the Confederacy and considered traitors, they could not participate in designing the state's principles and framework of government. Therefore, the delegates to these conventions were dedicated blacks of the Republican Party along with anti-secessionist whites from the South known as scalawags, and bold whites from the North known as carpetbaggers. Together, they wrote good constitutions for each of their states, which provided for public schools and equal rights for all of the state's citizens, regardless of race. As the states approved their new constitutions and the 14th Amendment, they were readmitted back into the United States with full states' rights. In 1866, Tennessee was readmitted into the Union. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Arkansas, and Louisiana were readmitted during the year of 1868. Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas were readmitted by 1870.
Conservatives resist. Now, white Southerners that had held power before and during the Civil War did not look too fondly on the Reconstruction efforts, and kind of rightfully so. These conservatives did not want the South to change, so they did everything that they could to try and keep things the same as they were before the war. And they were willing to let African Americans vote or hold office, but they wanted to keep the real power in the hands of the whites. So you can see from this political cartoon, you have a soldier in the Confederate Army, and then a few years after the war, it's really just a change of banners. The same person fighting for the Confederacy was joining the KKK and trying to vote to put Democratic leaders and some of these former leaders back into office in the South. So to try and keep whites in power, the way that a lot of people went about it was to try and keep the African Americans from voting. Even though they had the right to vote, they tried to keep them out of the polls. So some formed secret societies to help them stay in power, and the most dangerous and the most infamous of these societies was the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. The goal of the KKK was to try and keep African Americans and Republicans out of power in the South. And they did so by riding around at night to homes of African Americans, homes of Republicans, where they would shout threats, burn wooden crosses, all while dressed in white robes and white hoods. Now, why did they dress up in robes and hoods? Well, it's because it said this is a secret society, and that way it would be much harder for the federal government or these new Republican governments to take action on them. So they dressed up in disguises, but they would shout threats and use violence. Some did do that. They resorted to all-out violence and murdered hundreds of African Americans and their white supporters. So groups ended up using scare tactics and terrorizing tactics to try and keep power out of the hands of African Americans and Republicans in the South. Now, the Klan did not represent everybody in the South. Many actually opposed what they were doing. They opposed the actions of the Klan, but couldn't really do anything to stop them. In Kentucky, freedmen appealed to Congress. They appealed to the federal government for help, and in 1870, the United States Congress made it a crime to force people not to vote. But some African Americans kept voting, but many stopped, mainly because they were afraid of the Klan. They are afraid of the repercussions that may come on them or on their families from the Ku Klux Klan. And our next video is actually going to talk about the formation of the Klan and why it was formed and how it operated in the South during Reconstruction.
A shadowland of secret clubs and societies began to take shape. In Mississippi, the White Liners. In Louisiana, the Knights of the White Camellia. And across the South, the Ku Klux Klan.
If you grow up in a society and where for centuries you have been taught that other people are your racial inferiors, it's very hard to accept the enormous social change involved in their emancipation. Any benefit that accrued to blackness was interpreted as a loss of whiteness. Education, the acquisition of property, was viewed as somehow unnatural.
The Ku Klux Klan does not see itself as lawlessness, but as the law. Because they do not believe that black men deserve political power or know what to do with it once they have it, they think that it's their right, maybe even their Christian responsibility, to destroy black political power before it has a chance to become too entrenched.
Abram Colby had been elected to the Georgia legislature, along with Tunis Campbell. The Democrats wanted to curb his power in the county. They tried bribes, but Colby turned them away. In October of 1869, the Klan set out to teach him a lesson.
They were the mercenary forces of the Democrats who were trying to regain power. They were not simply using the ballot because they felt they would lose at the ballot box. They were using violent coercion. They were eliminating their competitors.
Colby's attackers could not hide behind their hoods.
Some of them were the first-class men in our town. One is a lawyer, one a doctor, and some are farmers. I knew the voices of those men as well as I know my own.
They would take people out of their houses or their cabins in the dark of the night, strip them out in a road, make them run down the road, make them sometimes lie on a rock where they would be whipped, where men would line up to whip them. Sometimes they would burn parts of their bodies. These were sadistic tortures.
They said to me, "Do you think you will ever vote another damned radical ticket?" I said, if there was an election tomorrow, I would vote the radical ticket. They set in and whipped me 1,000 licks more.
This was a war of terror. The Ku Klux Klan, organized in 1867, is an original American terrorist organization.
Now, the last thing that I want to talk about are some of the challenges facing the South during Reconstruction. As you can see from these pictures, these are pictures cycling through of Charleston, South Carolina, and this is what Charleston looked like at the end of the Civil War. So there were a lot of challenges to rebuilding. You see buildings and farms just demolished, but despite all of the political difficulties, there was some good that came out of the Reconstruction governments. These governments built schools for whites and for African Americans, as well as they built railroads, bridges, telegraph lines, and rebuilt some of the roads. Because as you can see, they really needed it. But on the flip side, these new facilities really cost the taxpayers heavily. Now, before the Civil War, taxes in the South were very low, but now taxpayers were expected to really bear the burden of rebuilding the South. So the Southern taxpayers, they lost the war and then ultimately had to pay for that and pay for the rebuilding of the South. And it was this new tax burden mixed with corruption in many of the Reconstruction governments that really led many of these Southerners to despise these new state governments even more. Corruption was widespread, but most who held office really did attempt to improve the lives and the economy of the South. But the financial burden as well as the corruption, like it really just caused, like I said, many Southerners to despise the new governments even more. And for freedmen, Reconstruction was not a cure-all. They had left plantations that formerly they'd been forced to work on, but many ended up returning to these plantations as sharecroppers. And a sharecropper is someone who rents the farm, rents and farms the land that they live on. Some of the radical Republicans that we've discussed talked about giving freedmen 40 acres and a mule, or breaking up the plantations and distributing the land. But most Americans actually opposed these plans. And in the end, freedmen got the freedom that they wanted, and that was about it. They got freedom and then went back to working on the farms that they previously had been slaves. Some were able to become landowners through hard work and a little bit of luck, but like we said before, most ended up becoming sharecroppers. And actually, many poor whites became sharecroppers too, because a lot of them could not afford to buy the land that they farmed. And now they had to pay African Americans instead of just keeping them as slaves. So for some, sharecropping offered the hopes of one day owning their own farms, but for many, it became a way to keep slavery going without technically being slavery. So there was some good that came of these new Reconstruction governments, but for freedmen in the South, they gained the right to vote, but many, through the use of scare tactics, did not want to vote. And in the end, they got freedom, but that was about it.
The day was cloudless, the air soft and balmy, the wild vegetation that edged the river beautiful beyond description. Not a sound broke the stillness but the dip of our oars and the wild minor chant of the Negro boatmen.
Anxious to reclaim their land, 28-year-old Fan Butler and her father, Pierce, were nearing their plantation on St. Simon's Island in Georgia. Rice, not cotton, had been king here before the war. And Pierce Butler had been one of the richest of the rice aristocracy. Fan Butler's mother, the celebrated English actress Fanny Kemble, had made headlines around the world when she publicly declared that she could not live with a slaveholder. After her parents divorced, Fan Butler had to make a choice.
She was involved in not a brother's war, but a family war. When her parents were divorced, she took sides, and she sided with the South and with her father.
From the safety of Philadelphia, the Butlers heard that their land was being confiscated by victorious Union troops.
Pierce saw it not only as the possible ending of his family's plantations in Georgia, but he saw it as the end of a way of life that he treasured. And so they headed back south as soon as they could.
They found the Butler plantation in ruins.
My bed stood under a hole in the roof through which the rains came. The whole country was absolutely swept. Not a chicken, not an egg was left. For weeks, I lived on nothing but hominy, rice, and fish.
Fan and Pierce got one piece of good news. A federal decree returned the plantations to their original owners. But their claim on the land was fiercely resisted by freedmen.
Black Southerners say, the South is mine too. I helped make this place. I remember when this plantation was nothing other than woods. And we cleared it. And it's ours. And I'm not leaving it. This is rich land.
We found the Negroes on St. Simon's Island in a very different frame of mind. They had been brought under the influence of Northerners, some of whom had filled the poor people's minds with all sorts of vain hopes and ideas. Among others, that their former masters would not be allowed to return, and the land was theirs.
In this charged atmosphere, the butlers had to negotiate with their former slaves.
My father told the Negroes they might have their corn and cotton, but that they must put in 20 acres for him, for which he would give them food and clothing. And another year, when he hoped to put in several hundred acres, they should share the crop. They consented without any show of either pleasure or the reverse.
The new system came to be called sharecropping, but many landowners wanted something more than their share.
Pierce's plan was to evolve his relationship with his former slaves back into something that would probably look and work a lot like slavery. And as Fan would later say, when it was her land, you have the freedom to leave, but I have freedom too. And what's more, I own this land. And if you're going to stay here, you have to do what I say.
Fan Butler was not as confident as she sounded.
We are, I am afraid, going to have terrible trouble with the Negroes. And I see nothing but gloomy prospects for us ahead.
Which brings us to the assignment for today. So for today's assignment, I want you to just answer these 5 questions using complete sentences. Take your time. Some can be answered with a sentence, but some will require a little bit more. So, number 1, list the 3 groups that were involved in Reconstruction governments and the roles that they played. 2, what was the goal of the Ku Klux Klan, and what did the federal government do in response to their actions? Number 3, describe 2 economic problems faced by Reconstruction governments in the South. Number 4, what is sharecropping, and why did people become sharecroppers? Number 5, list 2 accomplishments of Reconstruction governments, and then evaluate the impact of each on the South. So 5 questions, 3 points per question for 15 total points. And like always, if you have any questions, please come and find me. Otherwise, I look forward to reading your responses, and I will see you in the future. Have a great, great rest of your day.